Australia has built more barrier fences than any nation on Earth. The Dingo Fence alone stretches 5,614 kilometers, 3 times the Great Wall of China. When they kept building thousands more, the world laughed. A country solving its problems with wire and posts, but with feral predators killing 4 million mammals every day, the results a decade later did not just silence critics, they exposed a truth nobody saw coming. Every sunrise across the Australian outback, the silent war played out in numbers too large to grasp. Feral cats and red foxes, both introduced by European settlers, hunted with relentless efficiency. Together, they killed more than 4 million native mammals every single day. That number became the shadow haunting every conservation plan, every livestock forecast, every conversation in the shearing sheds of Queensland and New South Wales. On the open rangelands, sheep farming teetered on the edge of collapse. In Queensland alone, the state flock plummeted from nearly 9 million sheep at the turn of the century to under 2 million by 2016. Some stations, once thriving, saw lambing rates fall to just 2%. For every 100 ewes, only 2 lambs survived the onslaught. On certain properties, wild dogs claimed 2,000 ewes in a single year, enough to force entire families off the land. Foxes and cats finished what the dogs began, wiping out new generations before they could take root. The impact wasn't limited to livestock. The same predators drove native species, bilbies, betongs, and numbats toward extinction. Across the continent, populations of small marsupials collapsed. In some regions, the landscape fell silent at night. The old chorus of hopping mice and bandicoots was replaced by the padded footfalls of feral hunters. Farmers watched their livelihoods unravel, wool sheds shuttered, shearing teams disbanded, and rural towns shrank as families abandoned hope of recovery. The economic toll spread beyond the paddocks. Local businesses lost customers, schools lost students, and entire communities faced a future with no way forward. The numbers were stark, but the human cost was measured in empty houses and closed storefronts. With the crisis deepening, the scale of predator-driven loss left little room for half measures. Any solution would have to match the magnitude of the threat, something radical enough to halt 4 million daily kills and bold enough to give both farmers and native wildlife a fighting chance. Out of this desperation, the idea of building thousands of kilometers of exclusion fences, once the punchline of global ridicule, began to look less like folly and more like the last line of defense. Chris Edgerton remembers the first morning the Lagoon Creek cluster fence closed. Before sunrise, he and his neighbors walked the new line, running gloved hands along the steel mesh. For months, they had pooled savings and borrowed against next year's wool clip, betting everything on a barrier that stretched farther than most country roads. Their cluster was one of 57 built in the first 2 rounds of the Queensland Feral Pest Initiative. Across the state, 353 landholders joined forces, fencing 4.3 million hectares with 6,221 kilometers of netting, enough to cross from Brisbane to Perth and back again. The rollout was not a government handout. The Queensland Feral Pest Initiative required every cluster to raise at least 30% of the cost up front. Some chipped in labor, others mortgaged machinery or sold off old stock. The state put up $18 million for the first 2 rounds, but every post, every roll of wire had to be justified with receipts. By 2024, the total length of cluster fencing in Queensland would surpass 9,400 kilometers, with more than 1,500 new kilometers scheduled for completion in a single year. Chris's group was not alone. In central western Queensland, the RayPad Alliance coordinated 23 clusters in the latest round, covering 124 properties and 1.5 million hectares, with 2,563 kilometers of fence. Each cluster formed a biosecure zone, locking out wild dogs, foxes, and feral cats. The logistics were staggering. Fencing contractors worked through heat waves, digging post holes in red dust, welding mesh through storms, and hauling supplies hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town. Landholders mapped every boundary with GPS, checked every join, and patrolled the lines on motorbikes and quad bikes. The co-contribution model forced neighbors, sometimes rivals for decades, to collaborate. Fencing meetings became strategy sessions, with spreadsheets open beside battered hats and thermos mugs. Some clusters negotiated bulk discounts on materials. Others shared equipment and labor, trading skills and stories as the kilometers ticked by. The MERI program sent inspectors to verify construction, measuring not just the length of wire, but the strength of the social fabric holding each cluster together. By the time the final gate was shut, over 9,400 kilometers of exclusion fencing had been installed across Queensland. The numbers were unprecedented, but the real change lay in the sense of agency returned to people like Chris, where once there had been resignation and loss, now there was a hard-won line in the sand, a physical and psychological barrier against the relentless tide of predation. The next test would be whether these fences could deliver on their promise, restoring not just sheep numbers, but the economic lifeblood of entire regions. The numbers that once spelled disaster for Queensland's sheep country began flipping in record time. Within 2 years of the first cluster fences closing, lambing rates that had languished at 2% shot up to an average of 85%. In some clusters, the tally broke 100%, more lambs born than ewes counted, thanks to twin births and the return of previously barren breeders. The sheep head count surged by nearly half across fenced regions, reversing decades of decline. Wool values didn't just recover, they more than doubled, outpacing fence construction costs within 3 seasons. The economic ripple was impossible to ignore. Where government modeling had forecast a $24 million return on public investment, actual regional benefits soared to $78 million per year. For every dollar spent on fencing, the region saw more than $3 in direct economic gain. Towns that had lost their shearing teams saw them return, with an extra 700,000 sheep projected to bring in $2 million a year in wages for shearers and lamb markers alone. The sense of revival spread from farm gates to main streets as local businesses and schools felt the impact of renewed prosperity. The transformation wasn't limited to agriculture. Inside predator-proof sanctuaries, native wildlife rebounded at a scale few had dared hope for. In South Australia's arid recovery reserve, native rodent numbers climbed tenfold, while bilby populations rose from a few hundred to over 4,000. Numbats, once nearly vanished from the region, returned in the hundreds. Across the Australian Wildlife Conservancy's network, 23 locally extinct mammals were reintroduced, with survival rates topping 70%. The fences, once a punchline, now underpinned both economic survival and the comeback of species thought lost. For landholders like Chris Edgerton, the change was tangible. Flocks flourished where they had withered, and the night air carried the sounds of native animals once more. The fences drew a new line between collapse and renewal, offering a glimpse of what could be gained or lost, depending on which barriers Australia chose to keep and which to question. A single line stretching more than 5,600 kilometers across Australia has become the focus of a continent-wide ecological debate. The Dingo Fence, once built to save sheep, now draws the attention of scientists tracking its impact from space. In 2023, the New South Wales government committed $37.5 million Australian dollars to extend the barrier by another 1,000 kilometers, aiming to shield more grazing land from predation. But the satellite record tells another story, a story written in the color of the land itself. Dr. David Letnick, an ecologist at UNSW, spent years analyzing 32 years of NASA Landsat images along the fence's length. His team measured the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI, a satellite-derived signal of plant growth. The data revealed a striking pattern, a sharp, persistent drop in NDVY on the Dingo free side, visible as a faint but unmistakable line from orbit. Over 3 decades, the side without dingoes showed a 12% decline in cumulative greenness compared to the side where dingoes still roam. The contrast is so consistent, Letnick explains, that you can trace the fence's path by the vegetation gradient alone, an ecological boundary etched into the continent, visible from space. The numbers offer a sobering reversal of expectations. Where livestock losses fell, kangaroo populations soared, stripping grasses and exposing soil to erosion. Field studies in the Strzelecki Desert found bare ground increased by 30% and shrub cover dropped by nearly half inside the dingo free zone. The ecological cost is not hidden in fine print. It runs for thousands of kilometers, captured in every satellite pass. The very fence that protected millions in livestock losses has, over time, helped drive a slow decline in the landscape's resilience, raising the question of whether the next billion-dollar extension will protect the land or lock in its fragility. Today, over 20,000 kilometers of fencing cut through Australia, reviving sheep flocks and resurrecting vanished species, yet fragmenting entire ecosystems. As global crises force hard choices, Australia's experiment stands as a warning and a blueprint. When we draw lines across nature, the consequences never stop at the fence. What would you decide?